Coming up on this week's show, how to do word processing on your NES.
A weird Zelda bug revealed.
And we chat with the Xbox co-creator, Kevin Bachus.
And the Retro Hour podcast is brought to you every week with our incredible friends at Bitmap Books. Now, of course, point-and-click adventures are all over again at the moment. New Simon the Sorcerer game on the way. New Monkey Island just landed recently. And their book, The Art of Point-and-Click Adventure Games, is a massive 528-page celebration of that incredible genre, containing extensive interviews with key developers and running through some of the most beloved point-and-clicks of all time. Check it out on the rest of their retro gaming collection at bitmapbooks.com. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 347, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And great to have you joining us for another packed episode, bringing you up to speed on all the big happenings in the world of retro from over the last 7 days. We'll do a little round table, bringing you up to date on those news stories, and of course, a veteran of the industry in the second half of the show for an interview like we do every week. And now that we are into October, I must admit I do love this time of year. You know, here in the UK, it's getting dark at like 6 o'clock in the evenings now. Even, you know, put the heating on if you could afford it. Those Halloween films are starting. Although I did forget, you know, obviously with us being in a pandemic for a couple of years now, that actually all the old traditional illnesses still exist, including the dreaded cold and flu. So if I sound a little bit deeper than usual, I mean, you might like it, Joe. But that's my excuse this week.
Well, we always have a fair in the city. So it's like, a fair comes to town, and when I was a kid, it was always a time that it would get really cold that year. So have you been out on the fair, Dan, and partying?
I haven't been down for a cock on a stick, I must admit, which we should probably explain, because you put this on your Facebook. A cock on a stick is a Nottingham thing, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's a traditional, like a cockerel, but also we have it's a very weird fair. It's named after geese, so it's called the Goose Fair. And we eat peas, hot peas with mint sauce in that. It's very weird, the whole fair, but I do enjoy it. and with the pandemic, it runs for 100 years. This fair has, and it's only been shut down when the plague happened before. So the pandemic actually shut it down for 2 years. So it's really good to kind of have it back. And of course, all the stores are exactly the same, but this time you could win a Switch.
I'll be like, you got any SNESes?
Maybe some mini consoles,
yeah.
Well, while Ravi's been out and about, of course, Joe, you talked last week about you getting into the metaverse on your Quest VR. You did ask, actually, are there any suggestions for retro games on the Oculus Quest? And we did have a few, actually. Kinos on our Discord, he suggested something called Emu VR, which looks really cool. I don't know if you've checked this out before. It's really an emulator in virtual reality of your bedroom when you were a teenager or a kid. And actually you can play, and there's RetroArch in there as well, so you can play stuff like PlayStation, N64, GameCube, Dreamcast, Super Nintendo, even arcade games as well. It's a bit of a work in progress at the moment, and it's even got net play as well. So you and I could have a go with this online, Joe. It looks pretty cool.
I've been looking at it just before we started the show, because I saw you put it in the show notes, and I wasn't sure if it was a news article or not. Yeah, this looks really, really fun. I'm going to download this tonight. Literally, as soon as we finish this, I'm going to eat my dinner, and then I'm going to go download this and try and not get sucked into it until 5, 6 in the morning, because this looks absolutely amazing, and it's spot on what I said. I want to play retro in modern tech. Like, that's what I live and breathe. So this is absolutely perfect. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the suggestion, Nisos. And we do have a Discord, by the way. We're in there chatting all week. So if you do have any news articles you think will be good for us to chat about on the show, you can submit them in there. And we even have a little suggestion section for guests that you think will be good on the podcast as well. Now, we've had a few that we've reached out to over the last couple of weeks, thanks to suggestions in our Discord. And this week, my word, you've scored a big one, Ravi.
Oh, yes. This is a guest I've been after for absolutely ages. And this is one of our favourite, best interviews that we've ever done. It's so good, so insightful. This is Kevin Bachus, and he's a co-creator of the Xbox. So there were 4 guys that did the Xbox, and they were known as the kind of 4 musketeers within Microsoft. And Kevin was part of that division, and he also worked for some amazing companies. So he worked for Mindscape International before, which were a huge company. He's a development manager there. And then he went on to DirectX. So he's a product manager for DirectX. So we talk about some really interesting stuff here, actually. id Software and how they kind of worked with DirectX, and they had to convince them because there was a big battle between OpenGL and DirectX back then. But then how stuff like the development actually went to help with the Xbox, how the Xbox was created. He did stuff like focus groups, and they kind of brought people in and they said, Microsoft are going to make a console. And they said, what, the guys who make spreadsheets? And everybody burst out laughing. And, it's really hard to convince people that the Xbox was actually going to be cool. And it looked like Sony really, put the scares into Microsoft and got them really working. But also, he was amazingly in that interview, which was the attempt at Microsoft buying out Nintendo, which we saw some memos that were leaked recently about that. And we get a bit of inside info on that one as well. So this interview is just mind-blowing. It's got a little bit for everyone. You join me, Joe, and what did you think of the interview?
Yeah, I thought it was absolutely fantastic. I think, obviously, Ravi, I don't want to brown your nose you too much, but obviously it was fantastically researched. And it was, like you said, it was a little bit of everything in there. It's his career, obviously Mindscape, but then mostly with DirectX and the Xbox and Microsoft, and really interesting stories there. A really cool story about Half-Life, which I won't spoil, and the relationships that he had with, Gabe from Valve, and obviously with Bill Gates and
Sega as well, because
I was getting there, you're spoiling it. And then I was going to say, you researched it so well, you all about the Sega and the relationship with the Dreamcast, and then obviously the story of Nintendo. So there is literally, in these stories and in Kevin's history, there's so much like in the retro world, for PC and for console. And, I just thought it was an absolutely fantastic interview, and definitely one of the top 10 for me that we've ever done.
And the original Xbox as well, what a console. It's just, I think in many ways, obviously, it didn't sell as well as the PlayStation 1, but in some ways, it kind of reminds me a bit of, not that it was a failure like the Dreamcast was, but it kind of reminds me in that vein that it was very, maybe underappreciated at the time. And the more I look back on it, the more revolutionary I think that system was.
Well, it really got them going, didn't it, the Xbox? And now you've got the free consoles kind of dominating, Switch, PlayStation, and Xbox. And it's pretty amazing how the landscape changed when you think about, the only company really there that had a history with stuff was Nintendo.
And of course, games like, Halo Combat Evolved, Dead or Alive 3, I remember seeing that for the first time on the original Xbox as well. So, incredible systems. So we're going to be here all about that, the inside story on the Xbox, and some stories from Mindscape as well with this week's special guest, Kevin Bachus. He'll be coming up in around 25 minutes from now. Now, of course, the first half of the podcast, that is where we bring you up to speed on the big headlines that have been happening in the world of retro from over the last week, and plenty going on over the last 7 days. Last week we were talking about this incredible new operating system for the Commodore 64, C64 OS. I know you were very impressed with that, Ravi.
Oh, it's lovely.
When you went through all the stuff that it can do. But not wanting to feel left out, someone's actually made another operating system, this time not quite as ambitious, but I think in many ways maybe even more impressive based on the hardware this is running on. This is an operating system, or at least the foundations of an OS, for the Nintendo Entertainment System.
Yeah, so the C64 one we saw was very complete. Like, they'd worked on it for a long time. There was lots of applications and stuff. This is the basics, the kind of start of a possible OS. It's looking a bit like a word processor to me, but it is called Nisos. That's how he wants to pronounce it. NES OS is kind of spelled, but Nisos. And it's very interesting. He looks like he's started to do some actual development on it, and using the features of the NES, because the NES was quite a low-powered machine to be doing an operating system on. And you have to kind of consider like using the devices on the NES and stuff, how you're going to be able to do input, stuff like, there's not a keyboard for it. So you're going to...
There is one.
Yeah, there is.
Oh, God. Is there?
Yeah, so there was the Family Basic keyboard, which was for the Famicom.
Ah, okay.
And he's actually made it compatible with the Nisos. So it's fully compatible. It types and everything on there. He had to do quite a bit of work to get it working, and I'm not too sure if you can make it compatible with the normal NES. So it works on the Famicom, because the Famicom had hardwired in controllers, and then it had a 15-pin connector on the front of it, which is what the family keyboard uses. But the American NES and the PAL NES have a 9-pin connectors for their controllers, which were removable. So I'm not too sure if you can get it to run with the keyboard on a PAL or a NTSC NES, but it certainly works if you're running it on a Famicom.
That's why you're our console expert, Joe.
But with that in mind, it is compatible. The word processor he's got on there, it is completely compatible with the controller. It seems a bit fiddly. So there's 64 possible characters on there. And to essentially go through them on the controller, you have to press the A button and then hold it, and it will cycle through all the characters. And then if you want to go back, you have to hold select and A to go backwards the other way.
So you wouldn't want to write a dissertation using this?
No, probably not. And then I think you press, is it the B button, which will move the cursor a space forward. And then if you press select and B, it will move it backwards. So definitely fiddly, but interesting that he's got it working on such a limited controller.
So this is it's really two core applications he's made, isn't it? So this Nisos, it's a settings program where you can go in and kind of fiddle around with the files that are stored in the 2K of NV RAM he's got in there as well. And you can do stuff like, check out free system memory, show some stats about the system as well. And the main thing is a word processor. And what I think is very cool is you can actually save up to 8 files that you can then load up again in this word processor next time you actually launch it. So it is a proper word processor. And, that's the important thing about having a word processor, that you can save your work and go back to it another day.
Yeah, and I think you're right there about the RAM as well and stuff, because just storage is going to be a real issue on this if you're actually running anything. And if you're expanding it, adding programs and functionality, it's going to have to be really, really finely tuned. I don't know. Is there any way of expanding the kind of thing, or having a bigger cart and maybe a bit more RAM on the cart?
Yeah, I mean, it's only got 2K of NVRAM in here at the moment. But there's also a desktop as well, where there are files that you can save on there, and they've got icons as well. And there's, all the elements that you'd find in a basic graphical user interface. There's a mouse cursor there and a text cursor, close gadgets and stuff at the bottom too, so you can swap between the screens. So, I mean, it is very limited at the moment, but I think the fact that he's got the foundations of what we know as an operating system running on the NES, it is a pretty impressive foundation, I think, so far. And it's free. Because, we're talking about the Commodore 64 one last week, which I think is about £40. But like you said, Rav, years worth of work have gone into that. This at the moment, though, it's just kind of a little proof of concept, I suppose. And it's by a guy called Inkbox, who's put this video up on YouTube, and there's a website for it as well. So if you want to check out that, I'll link it up in our show notes at theretrohour.com. Now, one of my favourite things about running my old computers, I've got to admit, because a lot of people, when I make YouTube videos showing old PCs or old Amigas, that kind of thing, you always get a lot of people going, well, why bother having that around the house? Why don't you just run emulation? But I think for me, there's something so tangible about having the original hardware there, the feel of the keyboard under your fingers, the floppy disks, putting them into the drive, and the satisfaction of ejecting them and using the original mouse. It's just a different experience, isn't it?
It's like that kind of physicality, and you feel a lot more kind of connected with the machine as well. I really do love using the old ones, because you actually put something in the device, and you could, even when you had a CD drive and it wouldn't have a loading tray on those Mac Minis and stuff, and it would just suck the disc in. I always kind of felt that was a bit wrong. I need a bit of physicality or something.
Give me
to be
a caddy
connected.
on my CD-ROM drive. That's what I need.
Or something like that. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. So, I mean, generally, I'd say I'm in that halfway house kind of thing when it comes to retro computers. I'll use stuff like, compact flash cards for replacements. I'll use EverDrives on my Super Nintendo, on my Mega Drive, and that kind of thing. I'm kind of all right to meet halfway, but there is one thing that I do miss about replacing a hard disk in an old PC, and that is the sound that old hard disks used to make. Do you remember like launching Windows 95 and hearing the disk just going crazy in your PC when it loaded up?
Not even hearing it, feeling it vibrating in the desk. that was a big part of it. And, you know, I think that kind of loading sound thing also works for every kind of retro format. So, you know, people had the tape drives and they'd be able to hear different tones in the tape and work out exactly what was going on with the tape. I remember hearing sectors being read on a floppy drive and just thinking, right, we've loaded to this point. Oh, there's a bit of an error there. And, you know, you'd start to feel kind of connected with the machine, and especially with hard drives as well. When you were reading something or the hard drive was going crazy, you could hear some like immense noises and stuff, and you really got used to that as well. You thought, right, I'm loading a big program. Here we go. And you'd hear that kind of repetitive clicking, and it would get a lot more intense.
Yeah, well, it turns out that we're not the only people who, you know, are kind of a bit obsessive with this kind of thing and miss those sounds from back in the day. So I do think, you know, hearing the sounds of old machines is definitely a big thing for, you know, ticking nostalgia. But it turns out a guy from Germany called Matthias Werner, he's come up with a method of using, and this is not new. I remember them doing this on the, you know, the Gotek. Now, the Gotek is it's a floppy disk replacement unit where you can use USB keys. And, you know, emulates disk images. But there was actually a few people who put a speaker in there, so it would kind of make the sound that a floppy disk would make, although it never really sounded right to me on the Gotek. But this one actually works quite well. Now, he's designed a tiny PCB that attaches to the connector to the disk access LED. So then when you're using stuff like an SD card or a compact flash card inside your old machine, to replace the hard disk, there's a tiny electrical buzzer that will emit a really brief click every time the LED flashes on your machine. And there is a video on YouTube by a guy called Root42 who's demonstrated it. So this is what it sounds like. See if you think this reminds you of like an old Windows PC.
Okay, there we go. And maybe also let's start up WinWord 2.0 because that's the largest program I got. That's that, and also let's load a document and hear what that sounds like. And maybe even the help file.
Oh, I love that sound so much. Yeah.
That is quite authentic, isn't it?
It does sound quite authentic, and like, you know, he's talking about this device and kind of why it was created as well. And I think, you know, with the LED light, that was another thing, you know, like on the Amiga we'd see it, but also on lots of other devices, you'd have that little flashing LED light, and all that stuff is hidden nowadays. You know, you've just got an aluminum case, or you've just got your laptop or something. You don't really see that, and I think this is great because it supports like SSDs. It supports, you know, the latest kind of technology, flash devices in there, compact flash, SD cards as well, and it's a tiny little board. And it's actually being sold at the moment. So you can check it out on a Surda shop. And it's called the Hard Disk Drive Clicker. So HDD Clicker. And it's only €25 per unit. And I think, you know, I actually want one of these. I'd love to see these kind of, you know, getting installed in these modern silent devices. It's weird, isn't it? Like we're looking at, you know, cars at the moment, and you're getting electric cars and stuff, and some of them are completely silent, and companies
amount of times I've nearly been run over by one coming around the corner.
Yeah, and companies are actually now installing like sounds in them. You know, you get like muscle car sounds in some of them and stuff, and people kind of miss that, and I think this is the kind of computer equivalent of that. It's really awesome. I love the whole idea of this.
But I think, you know, for using a retro machine, you know, if you've got the original hardware, it just sounds weird when it's not making any sound, doesn't it? Because you expect that from it.
Yeah, you get a buzz from the monitor. You know, you get the sound of the hard drive going up. You've all sorts of sounds that you just don't experience nowadays. I can imagine taking a kid and kind of playing the old machine, and they're just like, how did you cope with this noise? And we're like, we blasted the music over the top of all of that. You know,
I think the next thing they need to do is emulate the smell of burning dust on like a CRT screen.
A little device.
Yeah. I love the comments on the article here on the register that I put in the show notes as well. This guy's like, what next? A bunch of tiny hammers that you can attach to a laser printer to recreate the racket of a dot matrix printer. Maybe a modem screech for Wi-Fi adapters.
A static creator for your screen so you can touch the static at the beginning.
Well, I've got an old 486 that has like a hard disk in there from 1992, and it's still, it sounds exactly like that, but it's getting to that age now where sometimes I'll turn it on, it won't spin up. But if I give it a little tap, then it'll wake up the drive, it's kind of getting sticky now.
Didn't I give you like a SCSI drive years ago, and you turn that on and it went and that was like a total different sound as well. So maybe they could have a profile of sounds on these devices you could go through.
I think that drive you gave me, I had my window open and it flew off, I think, like a drone. Yeah, if you do miss the sounds of old PCs, I do think audio is a big part of it. So if you want to get hold of one of those adapters, they're available now. I'll link that up in our show notes as well. And I thought this was quite interesting. A thread on Twitter talking about a very subtle difference between a couple of N64 Zelda games, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. And is this something you'd noticed before, Joe? 'Cause it turns out there's actually a bit of a graphical rendering bug in here on a certain item in the game.
Yeah, I've never noticed this because it's such a small detail. And I love Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Like, they're two of my favorite games of all time. And it's such a strange, small detail. Not a weapon you use too much after early game. So essentially, there's the Deku stick or the Deku stick, however you want to say it. I always call it a Deku stick. For the uninitiated, for the N64 Zelda games, a big stick. You get pretty earlier
on. It's a staff, isn't it?
It's a staff. It's a consumable weapon, which you can use on enemies. It's weaker than your sword, but you can use it on enemies. The main use I always found for it is when you're doing puzzles, you can set them on fire. So if you need to light lanterns in a room from one fire, and then there's like 10 lanterns you need to light, you light the stick on fire and you run along and light them all. So famously, Majora's Mask came out, was it within the year? Or only like a year after Ocarina of Time because of...
Yeah, they're very close.
It was very close, and Majora's Mask used like all of Ocarina of Time's assets and just slightly changed them and slightly changed the graphics and the colours and stuff. Like, not all the assets, but it used a lot from Ocarina of Time. And the Deku stick is a weapon in Majora's Mask as well. And as it turns out, they both look slightly different from one game to the other. The textures on them are very, very different. Ultimately, they both look like a brown stick, a brown straight branch, which you'd get off a tree. Brown with some blacks and other browns on there. And as it turns out, Twitter user DarkEye144 has essentially debugged the games and found that neither of them, from what I understand, are actually using the correct texture of what the stick should have ever looked like. As it turns out, it's actually due to a bug in the game. So in Majora's Mask, it's actually using a texture of Link's hair zoomed in and stretched around the stick.
So it's a stick of hair.
Yeah, essentially. But it looks like a stick. And then in the second one, in Majora's Mask, it looks slightly different. And it's essentially, from what I understand once again, a piece of texture from Ocarina of Time, which isn't used in Majora's Mask, because as I say, the assets are all, reused in Majora's Mask. It's an asset from the in-game menu, the border of when you view Link and you put when you equip weapons, and it shows like a sprite of not a sprite, but a character model of Link, like holding whatever weapon you've just equipped it in with. And essentially, it uses the border, the brown kind of like textured border of that screen, and wraps it around the stick. And essentially, what they're saying is they think the creators of the games were aware of this bug because it still looked like a stick. They just left it because it looks fine.
It's some kind of texture swapping that's going on then.
Yeah.
Well, no, the issue is that it's the assets for the stick is meant to be 8x8.
Right.
But what they've done is, for some reason, there's a bug in the code. They've actually loaded in 16 by 16 pixels. So it loads the texture for the stick, but then it also puts in what's after it as well to fill the other 8 pixels. So that's where you're getting all this extra stuff from in there. So really, it was just a case of, instead of writing 8 by 8, they wrote 16 by 16 by mistake. So it's dragging in loads of extra stuff. But if you look at the thread that he's done on Twitter, he actually fixes a bug, and you can see what the stick should have looked like, which is instead of having these kind of weird textures on it, it is literally just a flat brown stick.
Trust Zelda fans to get this detailed. Do you think there's going to be like a stick update then?
There might
be. A stick ROM.
There might be a ROM where they fix it. But ultimately, all 3 of them just look like a stick. With just slightly different patterns on them.
Yeah, I don't think in any other game people would spot like such a difference, but because it's such a popular title, and because it's so kind of legendary, everything's been analyzed in it so much that even the kind of slight difference in texture that I'm seeing here becomes a kind of story.
I imagine they probably looked at it like you said, they probably were aware of it, but I actually think it looks better with the bug. Maybe that's why they left it in.
Yeah, I agree. It looks better with the bug. It looks more like a stick. There's more texture to it.
And if it wasn't a famous stick as well, it wouldn't have this treatment, would it? But
yeah,
it's quite
absolutely.
a famous stick.
If it was a really, this would only happen if it's a notoriously bad famous game or a notoriously good famous game. If it was a completely bang average game, which just kind of came and went, then I don't think anybody would be looking at the stick and the assets that create the stick and the textures. But because, like you say, it's Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, it's Zelda, this is why we've got the diehard fans looking at these things.
And to be fair, if you played that, on RF on your 14-inch CRT TV through the N64 Vaseline effect, you probably wouldn't have even noticed it all that much back in the day anyway. Just now we have like HD upscaling and all that. People are spotting these things. So it is an interesting read, though. So if you want to check that out, I'll put a link to the Twitter thread and the article on Nintendo Life. You'll find that. And the rest of the stories in our show notes at theretrohour.com. Now, a couple of really impressive games to talk about in just a moment, including a really cool-looking new fighter for the Commodore 64, and, of course, our special guest, Kevin Bachus, coming up on the show in just a few minutes. Before that, though, just a quick reminder that, we bring you this podcast each and every Friday. We do, 51 episodes a year? We take 1 week off between Christmas and New Year. Apart from that, we're here every weekend for you, bringing you up to speed on the news, bringing you a guest every week. We work tirelessly throughout the week, even when, you're really suffering, like I am. I've got the man flu. I've literally got...
Get the tiny eye.
We couldn't record yesterday because Dan was like, I have no voice. Like, we have to wait for his voice to recover. Yeah.
That is the commitment. Normally most guys would be in bed for a week with this kind of man flu that I've got. But we do this show every week because we love doing it. But if you'd like to see it continue into 2023, we do appreciate anything we get into our Patreon. Think of it as a little tip jar. All that money just goes into keeping the lights on and making sure that we can continue to bring this show. Because, when it comes up to January, that's when we have all our renewal costs, audio hosting, webs, all that kind of stuff. So it just helps us with the day-to-day running of it. And, of course, we give you back in return for backing us on Patreon as well. We're not all take. Plenty of perks for being a supporter of this show, isn't there, Joe?
Yeah, I knew you were going to put it on me this week. Yes. Plenty of
you do it
perks.
so well.
I don't know about that. But yeah, no, like you say, we always do try to give back. Lots of perks on there. Some weeks you get the episode early. Most weeks, if not all weeks now, you get a couple of extra news stories. That's become a bit of a common theme for us, as we are definitely the Retro 2 Hour most weeks. So, any sort of cut content or cut stories are usually left in there for the Patreons. You get access to our Discord, which is a really, really good community page, as Dan said earlier on. Lots of people suggesting guests for us and news stories, which really helps us out, but also, gives that opportunity. All 3 of us are on there talking and stuff as well. And then the other 2 perks, which I absolutely love, we do also do the After Hours, which is the second podcast we do, which I think we're closing in on 30 episodes now.
Yeah,
of that.
Not far off.
Yeah, we do one of them a month. Where we do all sorts on that. We give our own opinions and reviews on certain consoles and our favourite memories of those consoles and particular styles of games, as well as kind of revisiting years in retro gaming. So going back and talking about, the 80s and the 90s and focusing on a particular year. and also doing some game reviews, which has been really fun. We've given each other games to review, as well as had our Discord people suggest games for us, which has been really interesting. And then obviously last Sunday of every month, we do the Patreon Hangout, which is where everybody's welcome to come and chat, whether they want to come on camera, whether they just want to listen, and literally just hang out with us for a couple of hours on a Sunday night. Most of us have a beer or a cider, some chocolate and some sweets, and we all just sit there talking about retro games. Sometimes it goes off on a tangent. We talk about mobile phones, OS
Movies.
setups, anything, what did you say, Dan?
Movies, all sorts.
All sorts, which has just been amazing. And I really, truly feel like I've made friends on there, and I look forward to seeing people on there. And sometimes it's, people can't make it, and it's a shame. And it's like, oh man, that'd be so, looking forward to talking to so-and-so. But yeah, man, we do like to give back. We understand at the moment times are definitely, are hard, especially in the UK and lots of other places in the world. So it does mean a massive amount to us when people do donate, even if it's just a couple of pounds, a couple of dollars a month. We really, really do appreciate it, and we do try to give back.
Yeah, we're totally like independent. We're not like IGN or any big kind of thing. It's just three lads kind of doing a podcast, interviewing tons and tons and tons of people week in and week out.
Yeah, and I've just looked, actually, the next Patrons Hangout is going to be on October 30th, so I expect
spooky
full-on Halloween costumes for that one.
You guys and Halloween.
So yeah, if you'd like to join the Retro Hour Patreon community, new members always welcomed, and of course, for coming on board, you'll get a mention in the most prestigious high score table in the world of retro gaming, and we do have 3 new patrons to welcome this week, and let's induct them into the Hall of Fame.
Hall of Fame!
And a big welcome to Burnt.
The Amiga Show, which is such a good YouTube channel. Check it out. It's all done on an Amiga video toaster. Amazing. Amazing.
And a massive thank you to Rob Hull,
who all joined us on Patreon over the last week. Thank you so much for your support. And if you'd like to join the Retro Hour community on Patreon, all the details to join up right now are on our website at theretrohour.com. Right then, story of the original Xbox with Kevin Bachus coming up in just a moment. Before that, I'd like to get your opinion on this, Joe, as someone who is not a Commodore 64 gamer, but I know you do enjoy these kind of games. What about this? Someone's actually working on a version of SNK versus Capcom for the Commodore 64. Now, this is just a work in progress at the moment, but I've got to say, bearing in mind the hardware this is running on, I think this looks really impressive.
This looks really impressive for Commodore 64. It's really reminiscent. You guys might not know it. I'm not expecting you to know it because it's a really niche, odd game. But it's really reminiscent. Graphically, it really looks like Mighty Final Fight for the NES, which was a version of Final Fight, which obviously was a Capcom game for the Nintendo, where they have these kind of like chibi, kind of like smaller sprites, but with like bigger heads and stuff, kind of like cutesy looking. And obviously, Capcom versus SNK, the game it's, kind of based on, which is Capcom characters versus SNK characters, uses like the animation and the sprites and stuff from, the games, which the Capcom games and the SNK games, which were out at the time. So like Street Fighter 3 and King of Fighters 99, 98, and 2000. I actually am a big fan of Capcom vs. SNK 2 on the GameCube. So obviously this is Commodore 64, but if you told me this was an NES game, I mean, even for an NES game, it looks really good. The color palette is very typical Commodore 64 from what I know about the Commodore 64.
Yeah, those kind of muted, kind of pastel colors.
Yeah, but in terms of the graphics and definitely the frame rate and the playability of it, it looks absolutely fantastic. And as you say, it is only in demo form at the moment, but they've certainly got a lot of characters on there. There's quite a lot of playable characters on there. I want to say maybe 16 by the looks of things, from across the franchises. And then also there's loads of different stages in there, all recreated, from Street Fighter and, King of Fighters, SNK and stuff like that, which looks really cool. Even to a point where they've got like the classic, if you let the game run and play itself, where it shows you the stats about the characters, like how tall they were and what year they were born and stuff, which is like in the Street Fighter games. But the attention to detail in it's absolutely fantastic. So really, really impressive. find it odd that they called it SNK versus Capcom. Maybe that's what it's called in other territories. I know it's Capcom versus SNK. Maybe it's a legal thing, so they don't get into trouble.
Just swap them around and they'll be fine.
Swap it around and we'll be fine.
If you made a game called Hedgehog the Sonic, I'm sure you'd be fine.
Yeah, it'd be absolutely fine. Bandicoot Crash. But yeah, no, ultimately, my point is, I think this looks absolutely fantastic for the C64.
The special moves look good.
Yeah.
When they've got the kind of like effects going on the special moves and stuff. But I do know what you mean about the colors. I think maybe, you can get like brighter reds and stuff on the C64, but I think maybe because there's so much going on, maybe had to kind of limit it or do it in a certain way. That could change. You never know. They might just be getting it going and then add some more stuff in there. But it does feel a bit washed out. But then I'm complaining about a game that's on the C64 that looks well impressive. So it's a kind of balance, isn't it?
Yeah, there's that balance, and both these demos I've watched, there is unfortunately no music. Maybe that's how they've managed to get the frame rate and the animation on there and the playability looking so good. There's sound effects, which, sound great, but yeah, no music as it stands, unfortunately. And from reading the articles, there doesn't seem to be any discussion around the music, so it's just speculation there in terms of...
See, that is one thing. The Commodore 64's got such a good audio chip. It'd be great to have some music in there.
It'd be great to have some music on there, but maybe it is just a case it's not possible. Maybe they've just not done it yet, with it just being kind of like in demos and beta versions and stuff. But, as Ravi mentioned there, special moves, the animation on them, not just like fireballs and Hadoukens and stuff, but even, the animations of like spinning kicks and, spinning punches and stuff.
Is there like fantastic. A bit of screen shake as well and stuff like that? But I think they might even expand on that and stuff. But I am utterly impressed with this. Like, really nice.
And I think it's really impressive as well that it looks like there's only like two guys working on this, John Eggleton and Gianluca Alberico, who are using the Retro Fighter game engine for this. And it looks like, you mentioned about the name, Joe, it looks like it's actually based on the Neo Geo Pocket game, which was called SNK versus Capcom Match of the Millennium. It came out in 1999, so it looks like that's what it's based on.
You know what impresses me? The backgrounds. They've got animations of people actually doing stuff. And you'd think like, they want to save a bit of space. They'd have like, plain backgrounds, but that really adds to it as well.
And the fact that this can run on, of course, I mean, there are a few comments on the YouTube video. Some people are like, well, is this only going to run on emulation or do you need extra memory? But actually, this is designed and will run on a stock 64K Commodore 64 from 1982. So the fact that, it's so fluid and the sprites look gorgeous and... Yeah, so it looks absolutely amazing. Because I always remember playing games like, International Karate and Way of the Exploding Fist and stuff on the 64 back in the day. But God, if this had come out back then, I think this would have been probably the biggest selling title on the platform. Everyone would have wanted to own this. So, yeah, it's a work in progress at the moment. But if you want to check out the latest video that landed last week, it's on the Saberman channel. I'll put that in our show notes as well. Now, of course, we're going to be talking about the original Xbox, and I remember Half-Life being such an impressive game on that platform, and Half-Life 2 as well. And we're talking about virtual reality at the start of the show. Joe, you're getting into VR. I'm looking over at my Oculus Quest right now. Well, all of our worlds appear to be colliding right now because this is something that has been 10 years in the making, but now this looks almost too good to be true. You can actually play Half-Life 2 in virtual reality. 10 years in the making. How impressive does this look?
10 years kind of sounds standard for Half-Life, doesn't it, in the making?
Yeah, Half-Life 3 has been 20 years in the making.
Yeah, stuff always takes a long time, but this does look really fantastic. Like Half-Life, to me, it had that kind of cinematic feel that I didn't really get in other games, and that kind of immersive like storytelling. And I think the idea of doing that in VR is really exciting, actually. Later on, I used to play some FPSs. I remember Red Faction was a really good one. And that kind of had the Half-Life style of telling stuff. But that game is so iconic that, putting it into a VR world is a really smart idea. And, just seeing the work that they've done on this kind of effort, is it something that you'd be firing up on your headset?
Yeah, well, this is a guy called Nathan Andrews who he actually put together a little demo of kind of what Half-Life 2 could look like in virtual reality, and this was back in 2012. And of course, that was, before we had stuff like, Oculus Quests and really off-the-shelf cheap VR. He was using a Sony HMZ T1 back then, and he had some specialized motion tracking gear too. And he put out this little demo, and then, as it turns out, the Half-Life community is such a cult game. There are forums, there are community groups, there are Facebook groups, there are Discord groups. A load of people got involved, and there were dozens of volunteers who, over the last 10 years, have been contributing and actually making this a reality. And now Half-Life 2 VR mod is available to play. Now, this is a free open beta that you can play on Steam at the moment. And again, even though it's 10 years in the making, this is still very much a work in progress. But there are some videos that you can check out, and I'll put the article from Kotaku in our show notes too. And I think because Half-Life 2, it's such an iconic game, being able to play something that a lot of players, particularly, hardcore fans who've been playing this for like nearly 20 years, being able to see that game in 3D and actually being placed in the center of the world, that's just something else.
Well, it's one that's kind of been missed. So they've had like Half-Life Alyx, which was the kind of, the modern one. And there was also some Portal games, which for me, like, this is in VR, like, for me, a Portal game would be hell. Because even playing Portal normally, I felt sick. In VR, it would just be like a whole next level of sickness. But Half-Life 2, I can really imagine actually playing in VR. And it's got like great features like the gravity gun and stuff. And they're showing a video here of the like head tracking with the gravity gun. And it looks pretty impressive, to be honest.
Yeah, and all you need is the original Half-Life 2 that obviously you can buy on Steam. And they reckon that there's going to be like episode 1 and episode 2 support coming very soon, according to the team's page as well. And the thing is, with VR, I don't know, you found it on your Quest, Joe, motion sickness to me is very kind of subjective. Some games like racing games just send me over the edge, but I haven't really played that many first-person shooters in VR. Looking at this, it looks really, really cool, but I'm looking at it thinking, am I going to puke if I play this? Because it looks like you could actually play this on the Quest 2, but I think you need it tethered, with a USB cable to a PC to play it on there.
So I've only played Beat Saber on my Quest and then Resident Evil 4. And Resident Evil 4, I'm happy to report, hasn't made me motion sick at all. And I do get travel sick under particular circumstances. I get travel sick on buses and coaches, funny enough, but not really in the car. But I've been absolutely fine. But then I've been playing all the bonus modes on it, and then over the last couple of nights, I've actually played the campaign. And there's a part in the game where you have to drive a speedboat, and it actually came up with a warning as I got on the speedboat saying, you're playing the immersive mode. This can cause like
good luck.
Yeah, it can cause like
you're on your own.
Yeah, really bad motion sickness. And the segment's only like 5-10 minutes long. And I was like, whoa, I'm starting to feel really sick. Like on but ultimately watching this Half-Life 2, it looks all right to me. I can't imagine. I think I'd be all right on it. There's bits where you are on, like a kind of like jet skis and boats and stuff on Half-Life, isn't there? Maybe similar situation. It's just the water physics that might make me feel poorly. But
you've never played Half-Life before, have you? Is it serious?
No, I've never played the Half. Why are you telling everybody this, Dan? I haven't played the Half-Life games. I should.
Since I got shamed a couple of weeks ago for only having completed like 10 games.
Yeah, well, that's worse. That's worse than I ever played Half-Life.
Well, I'm going to shame myself here. I've never been untethered from VR. So I used to have a tethered headset, which was the HTC Vive. And I remember playing an FPS game on there, but this was tough because it was an archery game. And I just remember, I didn't have a bow, but my God, my shoulders were killing after doing that. As I was going around doing this archery game, trying to pop balloons. But I really need to get one of these modern headsets, without the cables and kind of totally go free and run into walls and trip over the cat. I can't wait.
Well, that's the thing. We are the retro hour, even though we know we're talking about, state of the art kind of VR headsets and stuff like that. But I do think the fact that technology is improving so quickly, compare it. You'd have a room for your VR system. I remember, Ravi,
and a huge team as well to develop games. This is just one modder. that's kind of doing
Or
this.
team of modders, yeah.
Yeah,
one
team
guy
of
who
modders,
initiated it.
yeah.
Yeah, but and the fact that they are bringing these retro experiences, I think, for us, that's where the interest really lies, isn't it? I mentioned last week how I'd love to play Monkey Island in virtual reality, and maybe that'll be a thing that modders do, which would be incredible. So I do think it's really cool, particularly iconic games like Half-Life. So if you want to check that out right now, the beta is available on Steam, and I'll link it up in our show notes at theretrohour.com. Now, if you are a gamer of that generation, then I'm sure you're a big fan of the original Xbox, and we're going to get some incredible stories with the Xbox co-creator, Kevin Bachus. He's coming up on the show in just a minute. Before we do that, let's just take a quick second to give a big thank you to this week's sponsor, and that is a long-term sponsor of the Retro Hour podcast, our amazing friends at ExpressVPN. Now, I speak as someone who has actually had this experience, being very smug, thinking, I don't need a protective case on my smartphone. You might remember being there that time, Ravi, when I actually dropped it in the car park outside my work.
Oh, God, yeah.
Smashed my screen all over the place. Well, the thing is, going on the internet without ExpressVPN, that's like using your smartphone without a protective case on. Most of the time, you're probably going to be all right, but all it takes is one drop onto solid concrete, and then you'll be full of regret like I was. So our friends at ExpressVPN, we've got an amazing offer for you as well. And I know, Ravi, you're always our privacy advocate on this show as well. And you were very pleased when ExpressVPN came on board because you've used them for years. They are your VPN of choice.
Yes. They're incredibly fast. And that's a great part about ExpressVPN. Every time you're on a network and an unencrypted network, bad things can kind of happen. Like, hotels are really dangerous for it. Airports as well. People can actually set up networks that are pretending to be the kind of network that you actually want to connect to. And then they can, do a man-of-the-middle attack, and they can go in there and they can take all your information and personal details and stuff. And that's where it gets insecure. With ExpressVPN, you will be secure because you've got some amazing encryption there. They've got high-level encryption, which basically a supercomputer would take billions of years to get past. It's really easy to use. You just fire up the app, click on it, and then straight away you're protected. And that app works on so many different devices. So you can have it on phones, you can have it on laptops. I even have it on my laptop set to fire up as soon as I start. So that's really awesome because I can go into any cafe, or I can just go around if I'm on holiday or if I'm traveling, and I can get onto ExpressVPN. But also I'll be able to watch Netflix from another country as well, which is always a little bonus there. So if you want to protect your data, then this is definitely the way to go with ExpressVPN.
Yeah, so you can secure your online data today and use our exclusive link, and you'll get 3 months free on top of a 1-year plan, and you'll make a massive saving as well on the price. So head to expressvpn.com/retro. That's our link, so they know that we sent you, expressvpn.com/retro, and a big thank you to our sponsor, ExpressVPN. So next on the show, we are going to be talking to Kevin Bachus, Mindscape's International Development Manager, the DirectX Project Manager as well, and the Xbox co-creator. He is next on the Retro Hour podcast.
You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and we're here today with Kevin Bachus. Now, Kevin has done some amazing stuff. He's been the Mindscape International Development Manager. He's been the product manager of DirectX, the co-creator, and head of third-party relations for the Xbox. How are you doing, Kevin?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you on. And, we start every single episode with a question that will really take you back. What was one of your first kind of gaming memories or experiences that you had?
Well, I suppose like a lot of people, my first memory was going to the arcades. I grew up in the middle of the United States in Kansas, and at the local shopping center, when I was very young, they opened combination arcade and bumper car facility, which I loved. And I remember it very fondly. We used to go also to an arcade that had a robotic bear band, and just really some fond memories, not only of the games, but also of spending time with friends.
So you programmed games when you were in high school. What kind of stuff was you creating?
I mostly created little games that were sort of like space combat simulators, and some like Eliza style chat bots, and just little whatever kind of struck my fancy. Some side scrolling 2D adventures, a few different things. I actually built my first computer out of a kit when I was 12, and it was a Heathkit computer, and I got onto the bulletin board systems at the time, CompuServe and Prodigy, and met other people and kind of traded software through that. It was a great introduction to what later became the world of social media as we know it today.
That's really interesting, because kit computers were quite a thing, and you wouldn't even think of that nowadays, kind of building your own computer from scratch.
Well, in a way, you kind of do, right? I mean, you can sort of put together a graphics card and storage and motherboard and do that. I mean, obviously, it's not. I actually got out the soldering iron and kind of soldered transistors together. You certainly wouldn't do it that way, but some of that same spirit is still alive today with people who, put together their own rigs and modify them, upgrade them, overclock, that sort of stuff. It's still alive and well from my perspective.
Well, mine always crashed when I did that. I was wondering, you went into game journalism then and started working with a PC magazine. How important were the kind of games magazines back then?
Well, actually, my start was in technology magazines, not game magazines in particular. I, growing up in this small town in the middle of America, a lot of my friends' parents were like, "Oh, well, Kevin's in high tech. He'll go into high tech." And being a rebellious teenager, I kind of diverted into film production. I went to a film school and really enjoyed that, learned a lot. But there was something about games and technology that I found compelling. So my first job after college was actually as a labs editor for a company that for the publisher of PC Magazine, a new magazine that was specifically focused on the idea of bringing computers into the workplace, which was apparently a very controversial idea at the time. But personal computers on every desk and people using that, it was the future, and we helped bring it about by making it a little bit less mystical.
So you ended up working at Mindscape. What's the story there? What's kind of like the bridge between the journalism and then going into Mindscape? How did that come about?
Well, I was living not too far from their U.S. offices, and I had an opportunity to get to know the team there fairly well. Some of the people I had met in my previous life who were now working there, making a career of games, and they sort of started hanging around quite a bit. My fiance at the time took on a role there, first in marketing and later in product development. Now my wife, and since I was there all the time, they were like, "Look, you seem to be here often. Why don't you just start working for us?" And so I did.
They were a really huge company. We heard about them over here, and I was just wondering what the culture was like at Mindscape, and how big they were, and was it really like a friendly group, kind of family atmosphere?
It was really exciting. I mean, I couldn't ask for a better introduction into the game industry. For one thing, there were kind of two sides to the organization. There was the game side, but there was also the educational software side, which were very collegial, and there was a lot that you could learn from each other, but also kind of increased the overall footprint of the company because they were operating in two very, very fast-growing markets. Mindscape, when I joined it, was in the process of rebranding from its original name, the Software Toolworks. And the Software Toolworks is very famous for a number of very early products. I had some for my Heathkit. I remember I had, of all things, I had a recipe organizer from them, and a few other things. They're very famous for a typing tutelage software called Mavis Beacon Teaches Typing. Very few people knew at the time that Mavis Beacon was a completely fictitious person, but she introduced a lot of people to the idea of typing, which I hear is important when you have a computer. And so that was great, but also they were the first publicly listed video game publisher. I think a lot of people don't know that. They assume it maybe be Electronic Arts or Activision or something like that. Mindscape, actually the first games company on a public stock market. And then finally, and probably most important from my standpoint, we produced games for everything. We worked with Sony, we worked with Sega, Nintendo, 3DO, Amiga, PC, Mac, you name it. We made games for everything. And what an amazing experience that was to be able to get such a broad range of exposure to all of those platforms at a time when there was such vibrancy and everything was new and developing at the time. That's sort of how I ended up at my next stop at Microsoft, because we were one of the first publishers to start developing games specifically for Windows as opposed to MS-DOS. And it was my job to try to spend time with the folks at Microsoft to understand how we would go about doing that. And so I think that, that's certainly an important part of my journey, was being able to build those relationships and build that experience as we started to produce that. And it came about because we were embracing all these platforms.
So you mentioned, close relationships there, and famously Mindscape had a really close relationship with Nintendo. And back then it was quite difficult for a lot of publishers, to get that kind of relationship with Nintendo. They were quite, I guess, private. They were very, very strict with their rules and stuff. What was that like, and what games were you working on at the time?
Well, Mindscape had a relationship with Nintendo based on personal relationships at the head of the two companies. In fact, because of Mindscape's experience developing educational software, we were allowed to develop games using the Mario character. In fact, to some extent, I would not be surprised to learn that we were responsible for a brief pause that they had with the Mario character and a refocus on Donkey Kong with things like Donkey Kong Country. I think a lot of people were surprised and disappointed to find out that some of the Mario games that we produced were not games so much as educational software. I think they felt surprised by that, disappointed, and I did notice that at the time that Nintendo went a bit quiet with Mario, and then obviously brought him back bigger than ever. But that really came about because of relationships between the people at the top of both companies. And, I can't say enough about my admiration for Nintendo, something that I'm sure all of your listeners and everyone kind of involved in this shares as well.
Well, were there any particular big titles that you worked on there that you worked with and kind of really enjoyed?
Well, I think the best known Mindscape title was something called the Chess Master. But there were a lot of very early kind of 3D and CD-ROM based games. I came around just as the industry was shifting from floppy drives that had very, very small, very kind of limited graphic capabilities because of the capacity of the floppy disks to CD-ROM. In fact, Mindscape had made a deal with LucasArts to convert some of their floppy-based point-and-click adventure games to CD-ROM with up-res graphics and CD-based audio and a lot of really cool stuff that came about with that. But there are also a number of titles that I still feel very, very strongly about. We had a great relationship with a company based in Paris called Cryo Interactive, CRYO, and they did a title called Mega Race that actually had like a human sort of narrator. It was a futuristic racing game, kind of a battle game, and it was like set in a futuristic game show, and so there was actual like live, humans that had been filmed that were sort of narrating the race, and quite a few different things that we did back in the day, including some, like I said, some very early Windows titles that I was particularly impressed about, because it became very obvious to me as a gamer that Windows was about to take over the world, that we were all going to have Windows-based PCs, and the idea of like going back into MS-DOS to play games was going to be antiquated. So the question was really how to develop Windows games, not whether we would develop Windows games.
Mm. So speaking of Windows and Microsoft, and you mentioned earlier the relationship that you were building with Microsoft, moving from DOS to Windows, obviously, it was about to become absolutely huge. What's the story with you eventually moving to Microsoft and being employed by them?
Well, again, we were one of the first publishers to really embrace the idea of doing games for Windows. And so it was important to build a relationship to understand the technical capabilities and to be able to integrate between our development teams and Microsoft to get that understanding, the technical understanding, but also the marketing understanding. I mean, if we did this, one of the great things that Sega, Sony, and Nintendo did was that they created opportunities to promote our own games on their platforms. If you want to, when we did Xbox, we didn't promote Xbox so much as we did Halo, or PlayStation promoting Grand Theft Auto or Final Fantasy, and so a gamer would go into a shop and say, "Hey, I saw this game called Tomb Raider on television last night. I want to buy that. What do I need to be able to play it?" "Well, you need a PlayStation." "Okay, great. So I'll buy a PlayStation, I'll buy Tomb Raider, a couple controllers." And so we were looking for that sort of stuff, and Microsoft kind of really struggled with that because, at the company, like, games were a relatively small business compared to the behemoth that was operating systems or Office or, development tools or things like that. And so, I worked very, very closely with a number of the members of the DirectX team, Alex St. John, Jason Robar, Jason White, other people who were DirectX evangelists whose job it was to go out and encourage game developers to start using DirectX and to start developing for Windows. A lot of people forget that although Microsoft is a large and somewhat powerful company, they can't force you to do things on an open platform like Windows. They have to explain to you why it's in your best interests and, how it's going to make your game perform better and do that sort of stuff. That's why the title of evangelist came about, because they evangelize the benefits of the platform and, why you might want to, use these new capabilities. And so I worked with them a lot, and I kept, expressing frustration over the lack of marketing vehicles that were available for our games, which was a frustration that they shared as well. And so after a while, it was like, well, if you're so smart, you come figure it out. So I did.
And did they interview you, or was it just kind of like a smooth transition for you? They did. And what was that like?
No.
Was that intense?
It was, because it was a business role more than a technical role, it wasn't the sort of famous Microsoft vetting that you often heard about at the time. It was a bit like going to work for NASA, like the best and the brightest, saying to people, "Oh, I'm working at Microsoft." That there was a certain cachet to that. But really it was more kind of talking about, my perspectives about the game industry and listening to what the people that were there, were interested in, kind of, understanding some of their frustrations and their aspirations, and kind of talking hypothetically about, well, this is sort of how I'd approach that sort of a challenge. And I really, really enjoyed it very, very much. That process of getting to know them. A lot of people say that if you're a boat owner, the happiest days of your life are the days that you buy your boat and the day that you sell it. And I would say the same thing is true for many people who go to work for a large company like Microsoft. My happiest days were the day that I arrived and the day that I left. And I think that that's a fairly common sentiment because, I really enjoyed going there. And I also enjoyed kind of taking the lessons that I learned and moving on to the next phase of my career after that.
Well, you mentioned, they weren't that big on the gaming stuff. There were a few titles like Motocross Madness was one, and Flight Simulator as well. Were they really important for the kind of growth of the game section of Microsoft?
I think it was. Personally, I had an opportunity when I was very young to choose between whether I wanted to to be a PC gamer or buy a Macintosh. And for me, as a budding pilot, I got my pilot's license while I was in college, recreationally. Microsoft Flight Simulator, I'm not ashamed to say, was actually the reason why I chose to buy a PC in my own personal life. It was important. It was good. I do remember that at my new employee orientation, we had the chief operating officer of Microsoft, a guy named Bob Herbold, come to give a pep talk to the new employees, asked for questions. And my question was, many of the most popular games that are out there, the most successful games, involve some element of violence, which is something that Microsoft has steered clear of. Have you ever considered creating a kind of a secondary brand that you could release games under, games that were a bit more mature, had some violent elements to them? And he looked me up and down and said, games, like, why would we ever go through the time and effort to create a special brand just for games? And I was like, I wonder if I can get my old job back.
Oh, I was wondering, like, back then there was a big debate between when DirectX came out and OpenGL.
Yep.
Were you kind of like having to defend the advantages of DirectX quite a lot in the press and stuff?
Not so much in the press as I did. There was some of that, but mostly it was with game developers, particularly id Software, who became, I became pretty good friends with like John Carmack and Jay Wilbur and John Romero. Trying to get them, because they were very, very strong advocates of OpenGL, and I understand what their perspective was. But it was something that I really was taken a bit by surprise by, because it happened right around the time that I joined the company. At that time, I thought I was going to go in and start trying to put together some branding and some, programs and that sort of stuff. And I ended up spending, a large part of the first year at the company kind of defending our position, which was somewhat unpopular. And, when you have beloved icons like John Carmack coming out saying, "Hey, Microsoft's making a huge mistake here pushing this standard when we already have OpenGL, and we really want it and we don't understand it," then the fans get involved as well, and it sort of becomes a more entrenched position. And I wasn't expecting that, and it did take a lot of time to go deal with that. In addition, internally, the guy that ended up running the DirectX graphics APIs and was one of the other three guys that we started Xbox with, Otto Burkus, had been running Microsoft's own OpenGL. And when the decision was to really try to put a lot of focus behind Direct3D, they put Otto in charge. I think the idea was that, there's no better approach to try to put two teams together than to take the guy who was the fierce competitor internally and make it his responsibility to improve the other technology that was within the company. And, I think that ultimately, you can argue whether Microsoft's focus on Direct3D was right or wrong. But I think that, if you look back on the last many years of development and how far we progressed, I think that, it's the whole industry has done an unbelievable job of kind of figuring out where it wanted to go and how it wanted to use technologies and platforms to get there.
So I heard that you had to go to ID and kind of talk with them about getting a DirectX version of Quake as well. Well, Quake 3. Was that an interesting meeting?
Well, I really, really liked them and respected them, and I felt that we built a pretty good relationship. Obviously, we wanted to encourage them to do that. They were a little bit put out because I think that, some of the people who preceded me at Microsoft wanted to make a point, and so they had created a Direct3D wrapper, where some of id Software thought it was talking to OpenGL, but it was really talking to a translation layer that ended up talking to Direct3D, just to make the point that Direct3D was capable of doing it, which is kind of a nasty way of making that point, but effective nonetheless. And so they're a little put out by that. But look, all the developers that I worked with, I had such admiration for them and such respect for them, and the conversations were largely politics free. It was really more about the technical merits, and whether that was inside of Microsoft or outside of Microsoft, it was always a meritocracy when it came to technological ideas. There was no way that we were going to get a company like id or a company like Epic, who I also was very fortunate to build a great relationship with Tim Sweeney and Mark Rain and the folks over at Epic. All those conversations were really more about sort of what's the right thing for the product. And that helped to kind of inform a lot of the early thinking about what we wanted to do with Xbox and why we wanted to do it.
So Half-Life came to the PC. Did you see a huge growth in PC gaming at that point? The kind of late 90s, early 2000s?
I loved Half-Life. One of the last things that I did at Mindscape before I went to work for Microsoft was I had actually gone and licensed the Quake engine to do a game. We never actually ended up doing anything with it, but we were, depending on who you ask, we were either the first or second licensee of that engine, Valve being the other. And so I was very familiar with them. And, my relationship with it obviously predates my time at Microsoft because of those negotiations around that. I mean, I remember getting beta copies of, I can't remember if I got a beta of Wolfenstein. I definitely got beta copies of Doom before it was released, and Quake. And so, that preceded and predated my time at Microsoft. But the Valve guys, I got to know as like a fellow like early licensee of that engine, which is one of the first engines that was ever licensed. And so I got to know Gabe really well. And obviously, because of Gabe's time at Microsoft, he was very eager to try to build some sort of relationship. What very few people know is that actually I was talking with Gabe about the potential of bundling a version of Half-Life with, I think it was Windows 98. I felt really, really good about that. I thought it was a really good showcase. But again, the team at Microsoft felt that it was sort of the wrong, kind of the wrong foot forward, that it would send the wrong message because of the violent content of Half-Life. Even if the version that was bundled with Windows was relatively violence-free, that association would be problematic. And so it didn't end up going anywhere. But I really felt like that would be a strong statement, more so than Solitaire or Minesweeper. No disrespect to those pieces of software. They're obviously very, very popular. But I really wanted to move sort of much more casual gamers into understanding what was available, out there in the world of gaming beyond simple puzzle games.
Well, talking of video game violence as well, Game Blocker was a interesting kind of piece of technology, and were Microsoft kind of pushing stuff like that, and also what was their attitude towards video game violence at the time?
Not really. I think that their approach as the steward of the platform was relatively, hands off. Windows, Mac, open platforms. You don't have to have Microsoft's permission to make a Windows game. You don't have Apple. You need to have Apple's permission to have to develop a Macintosh game. And so I think, I don't think Microsoft really had much of a perspective at all about violence when it came to the platform. Obviously they wouldn't really promote violent games, but they wouldn't really prevent them either. It was sort of an arm's length relationship. Now, when it came to Microsoft's own published games, again, as I mentioned before, it was really much more interested in, puzzle games and, simulators and sports titles and that sort of thing that had more broad general appeal and didn't have negative connotations associated with it.
So what's the story behind the Sega collaboration with DirectX and Microsoft CE for the Dreamcast?
Well, again, that's something that slightly predates my time at the company. We were actually approached at Mindscape to do that, but clearly I heard about it a lot when I was at the company, and we were sort of in the process of transitioning towards Xbox. The idea is fairly simple. Microsoft at the time viewed itself, among other things, as first and foremost an operating system and development tools provider. Here was a new platform that was out there. Bill Gates personally had a relationship with the head of Sega at the time, and said, hey, if you're coming out with this new platform, you're going to need some tools and APIs and an operating system to go with it. And, so we've just released Windows CE for consumer electronics, for consumer devices. We think it would be, a great thing, a great addition. It would help your developers to build titles for it. And so Sega licensed it and provided it alongside kind of a lower level API of their own development. And of course, at the time, most developers were just getting out of using like assembly programming and, very low level programming. It hadn't been that many years on since that was the way that you develop games. And so the idea of having, sort of an abstracted operating system like Windows CE with the overhead that goes along with it, although there are benefits to doing that, the benefits of having a low level API like Sega was providing were more compelling. And so I think as a result, we saw more adoption, of those APIs than Windows CE. But I think that it was certainly part of Microsoft's hope that a platform is a platform is a platform, and whether it's a PC or whether it's some other type of device, it's something that they could help to to provide the basic functionality that any kind of application uses, file I/O and that sort of stuff. But again, I think most developers for Dreamcast, my impression was that, if it was a graphics intensive application, something that really required a lot of horsepower, that they'd rather go direct to the metal if they could.
So around that time, the PlayStation 2 was announced as well, and obviously the PlayStation had been tremendously successful. Do you think that affected Microsoft's view of gaming and what the future looked like?
Unquestionably. I was at the announcement of PlayStation 2 and went to talk to Phil Harrison afterwards about whether there was an opportunity for Microsoft and Sony to work together. And of course, there wasn't. But Xbox is really the result of a number of different things that all kind of happened simultaneously around that time. You had Microsoft dividing the Windows operating system group into a consumer Windows division and an enterprise Windows division, and the consumer Windows division looking for, a reason for being. You had the kind of cost performance curve really coming down for PC graphics hardware in particular, so that it would be feasible to produce a very high performance consumer electronics console device that used PC based technology. And then you had Microsoft itself wondering why it had been unsuccessful in the sort of sub $500 price category. And then last but not least was Sony coming out and saying, we're basically going to be the end of PC gaming as we know it. The emotion engine in PlayStation 2 is based on alien space technology that is light years beyond anything that's been seen before, and is going to completely transform the world. And people are going to, and I think one of the Sony executives actually made a comment about how, nobody was going to be gaming on PCs anymore once PlayStation 2 was available, which certainly got the attention of a lot of executives at Microsoft and wanted to know what was going to happen. The genesis of Xbox really goes back to a Think Week piece that was prepared by Otto, who I mentioned before, and Seamus Blackley, where, every week Bill would go off and, think deep thoughts about the company and ask each of the teams to write up a document about something that they're thinking about, something that they're really interested in. And oftentimes they would be asked to prepare something on a particular topic. At that time, Eric Rutter, who was Bill's technical advisor, asked the DirectX team to really kind of opine on what, these announcements about PlayStation 2 meant and Emotion Engine and what the potential impact to Microsoft might be. And so they basically wrote up an analysis that says, here's everything we know about Emotion Engine, and this is kind of what we think is going to happen with PlayStation 2 and the performance it's getting. And by the way, here's the state of the art of PC gaming PC graphics hardware and where we see that going. And at the end, it was like, by the way, we've talked about this a lot in the past. This might be the time for Microsoft to actually think about jumping into this business as well. And I think that's, without PlayStation 2, would Microsoft have gotten into the console business? Perhaps, but I think it's also an open question.
During the development of the Xbox, were there any ideas that kind of got dropped?
Absolutely.
Final version.
100%. I mean, the original idea of Xbox was really more of a kind of Trojan horse. The Windows and the PC platform in general had really expanded a lot over the years because it was a multifunction device that could be manufactured by a lot of different companies using a lot of different kind of components. And Windows was sort of the gatekeeper in the middle. It allowed applications from a lot of different manufacturers or a lot of different developers to talk to a PC, which could be comprised of all kinds of different graphics cards or storage devices or motherboards, that sort of thing. And that was really the role of Windows. And so it had sort of, but that's complicated. It's very difficult. And a lot of the challenges with stability or performance of that sort of stuff is the fact that Windows could never be entirely sure what applications would run in it or what hardware was running on. And so a lot of compromises had to be made. And so the idea was, hey, if you basically had a hardware standard that you got manufacturers like Dell or Mitsubishi or companies like that to go build, and it looked to the consumer like a consumer device. It didn't require you to install games. It didn't require patches or updates. There was no like Windows desktop. It basically looked like a game console. Like, could you actually really amplify the PC gaming business? And could you have something that would be really, really exciting for developers and for consumers? And the key to that was that you had a hardware standard that all the Xbox hardware conform to, and a very, very, very slim version of Windows that was the traffic cop between the games that had been developed for Windows and for Xbox as one binary that ran on that. And so the idea that in its very, very earliest phase was that this was going to be something that wasn't going to require software publishers to pay a royalty to Microsoft. It wasn't even going to be manufactured by Microsoft. It was going to be manufactured, and it was going to enable consumer electronics companies and PC companies to get into the console business. And also, it was something that that was going to to really kind of take that focus and really kind of run with it. And I think that that's obviously very, 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 very different from where the platform ended up. But yeah, I mean, there were a lot of things that as we talked to hardware manufacturers, we talked to game developers, we talked to publishers, we talked to consumers, we talked to everybody, they helped us to kind of refine the focus and to become much more console-like over the development of that, which was honestly a very, very short amount of time. I mean, if you look at the time that we first proposed to Microsoft that maybe we should think about making a game console, the time that it hit shelves, very, very short amount of time.
Well, I heard you guys were kind of sitting around, all four of you, in a group eating like jelly babies in the meetings and stuff. How important were those kind of, discussions and just sitting around the room and like shooting off ideas?
Well, they were fundamental, and I wish they were jelly babies because I have affinity for that. They were actually jelly bellies, which is a very different thing, just a sort of a standard small jelly bean. But I mean, those are some of my fondest memories from Microsoft because, the sky was the limit. We could have done everything. And what we did was, Microsoft really encourages people to think a lot about their business. And DirectX was not just about those technologies. DirectX was about the game industry. When Bill or Steve had a question about Activision or Electronic Arts, they didn't call Ed Fries and the guys in the game division because they were a competitor to those companies. They called us because we were interacting with them and we were talking to them and we knew what was going on and we would, interface with them. And so, we had the freedom and we had the relationships internally and externally to go to Rick Rashid and the guys in Microsoft Research or to go, outside to game developers and really kind of understand things and bounce ideas off of them. Hey, what do you think about this? This is what we want to do. And what's the right idea? And again, it was a meritocracy. The best ideas won. And there were a lot of challenges we had to overcome because, it's hard to even, think about this from the perspective of where we sit today. But the idea that could you create something built on PC technology that was instant on, that didn't take, a couple of minutes to boot up, that, could you do something that had, high performance graphics? I remember, going myself to the office of Craig Mundy, who was in charge of a lot of Microsoft's kind of, consumer electronics and graphics related initiatives and explaining to him, no, graphics technologies on the PC are every bit as good as some of the stuff that we're seeing out of Sony, maybe even better. And here's sort of what we're doing and here's where we're going. And this is sort of some of the stuff that, that we're seeing right now in that field that we're capable of doing. And even internally, there was a lot of, evangelism that had to work, but a lot of really amazing ideas. We were able to go to folks in research, to go to folks on the DirectX team like Mike Abrash, understand sort of what they were seeing out in the world, go to manufacturers like NVIDIA and ATI and 3DFX and understand what they were seeing, and then get together in that room and say, hey, here's what I heard, or what are we going to do about this, or who else can we talk to? Who else can we bring into the circle? What else do we want to do? I mean, that was everything. That was what made that all possible.
That is mind-blowing, that is, to be honest. And just with all these discussions and everything going off, was there thoughts and kind of things being thrown out there about Dreamcast collaboration and the Sidewinder collaboration that Microsoft had? Did that all help with the development of the Xbox?
Oh, unquestionably. One of the first things that we did was to reach out to our friends that we worked very closely with in Microsoft hardware, Brett Schneff, Rick Thompson, who ran that group, a lot of the folks over there, because, what we discovered was that there were other refugees from the game industry like ourselves who had come into the company. There was a guy named Don Coiner who had worked at Nintendo and was now in marketing. There was a woman named Jennifer Booth who had been at Sony, who is now at Microsoft, who understood the game industry and understood kind of those perspectives, because we viewed ourselves as outsiders inside of Microsoft. None of us, there were four of us originally on Xbox: Otto and Seamus, who I mentioned, and then my boss, Ted Hasse. Ted and Otto had been at Microsoft for a reasonable amount of time. Seamus and I were relatively new, and we viewed ourselves as being kind of outsiders who were, had come in from the game industry to try to, get Microsoft to do the right thing for everybody involved, because it would benefit Microsoft, it would benefit gamers, it would benefit game developers, and so we found more of those people, and we enlisted their help in this, and they became very passionate about the idea. Developing a game console at Microsoft wasn't a very controversial thought. It was pretty obvious. But what was controversial and not obvious was whether Microsoft would ever actually do it. I mean, I remember before I went to Microsoft thinking, if there was ever another company like a Sony, giant corporation, that would come into our industry and build another console, Microsoft is the obvious candidate. But they would never do it. It's just not kind of how they do things. And that persisted a lot. And I think, down to the last minute, there were always questions about would Microsoft have the fortitude to get into this business and do it this way. But, working with Rick and Brett and the team in Sidewinder allowed us to do things like create very early mock-ups. Like we created this plastic thing that looked like sort of like a game console that we could put in front of people and say, hey, this is what you need to think about. Don't think about it like a boxy PC. Like think about a thing that looks like this. This is what we're talking to you about today. Not a gaming PC, not a junior PC, but something that looks more like a console. And then obviously, having a game controller that worked with that, and doing those sorts of things helped to bring that to life and make it more real and more concrete than it would be otherwise.
While that was happening, what kind of alternative names were being thrown out, or was it always going to be the Xbox?
Well, no, it was not always going to be Xbox. I mean, we had to call it something, and people were just sort of, they were referring to it as the DirectX box. That DirectX box, like that, just like they had to refer to it as a thing. Yeah. Figuring like, okay, well, we'll put a pin in it and we'll come back to it later, and the marketing people will come up with something amazing that's incredible. And so it was, it was that DirectX box, and then it was like that Xbox. And, the name DirectX came because the idea was that these were APIs that would allow you to target the hardware more directly, graphics or sound or whatever it was. But and there was a family of it. So it was Direct Draw, it was Direct Sound, it was Direct, Play, things like that. Direct, blank, DirectX. That's how DirectX came about. So people are like, yeah, so like so these guys are thinking about building, a hardware spec for something that would be like a, some sort of a DirectX box, and then it was an X box. And then when we got permission to do it, obviously we brought in, the big brains and the consultants, and they came in and they're like, asked us all kinds of questions like, if this console were a tree, what kind of tree would it be? Or if it was a car, what kind of car would it be? And I remember my wife, who was on the project, said, well, it would be a motorcycle, it'd be a Harley Davidson. People, oh, it'd be a Porsche, it'd be a Ferrari. And so they went away and came up with a bunch of names that were all terrible, and they all sounded like car names. And we're like, no, these are awful. And they're like, oh, well, we're just trying to gauge your thoughts about stuff. These aren't the real names. And then they went off and did more exploration. And I remember we're in a meeting. They come in, they're like, okay, we tested all these names, including Xbox, and we have a winner. We have a name that is going to knock your socks off. This thing tested through the roof. Everybody loves it. We think this is fantastic. We're like, great, lay it on us. What's the name? They're like, the Microsoft 11X. We're like, what? The 11X, because it like goes to 11, it's like Spinal Tap. It goes to 11 and the X, and it's mysterious. And like, we look at each other like, these people are crazy. And so I turned to Don Coiner, and he's like, go lock up the Xbox trademark. And I'm like, yeah, I think we should probably do that. So we went and did that. We had to buy, Xbox.com was owned by a German porn company.
Nice.
So we had to go buy that in secret. Like we had to go create a shell company. And so we bought that from them. There was actually a publicly listed company in the US whose ticker symbol was XBOX, but they were in the process of going out of business. So they were very happy to get like a small amount of money. And so, we kind of went and locked that up. It was not a great trademark. And there were a lot of negatives to it. The letter X in Japan signifies bad or stop, so there, it wasn't obvious. One of the things that I realized from a lot of product naming over the years is that ultimately it just becomes like a natural thing. Like you just can't imagine it as something else. And so whatever initial concerns people would have, invariably over time it just becomes like an accepted fact that this thing is called this, and people, whatever they may think of originally, eventually it just becomes natural and comfortable.
I was wondering, when Bill announced it at GDC and stuff, it must have been good to talk about it after working on it in secrecy.
It was so fantastic, but it was also really weird because, we had been talking about this in secrecy for so long, particularly when the product actually launched. I remember Seamus and I were in Tokyo for the Japanese launch, and we're going to these places that we'd been to 100 times in Akihabara and places like that. And suddenly there are these big displays with Xbox, and people are wearing hats that say Xbox. And it's like, how do people know about our secret project? Like, it was kind of a weird adjustment to make from this idea of like secrecy and people not knowing about it to everybody knows about it and everybody's talking about it. But mostly we were just really, really happy that everybody loved it. The reaction that we got to Xbox was not, what a crazy idea. Like, oh my God, this is so original and, such an innovative idea. The reaction that we got was, what the heck took you guys so long? Which I think is a great reaction. It makes you feel like you're on the right path when everybody's like, well, duh. I mean, it's obvious that you guys were going to build it and it was going to be like that. The other weird reaction was that at that GDC, we had a lot of people coming up to us saying, hey, what company were you guys with originally? And we're like, what do you mean? Well, like, we don't remember Microsoft buying a console company. They assumed that there's no way that Microsoft could have come up with this idea on their own. They must have bought a company that was already developing it, and that wasn't true. It was entirely homegrown. And honestly, I mean, no disrespect to Microsoft, but I kind of took that as a compliment that they felt like it was something that was different from what Microsoft did in the past. Because in truth, one of the things that I had done particularly was to look at a lot of Microsoft's efforts in the consumer electronics space, most of which candidly were not that successful, trying to understand why. And oftentimes it was because they tried to do something in a different way. They tried to kind of move the industry in a different direction rather than trying to improve upon the direction that things were already going. And so the fact that people understood that in the game industry, game developers who we respected, who we loved, that they said, this is something that, that we can't see Microsoft doing. I mean, it was kind of a mixed blessing because I didn't want them to feel that about Microsoft, but I did want them to feel like it was something that was different than the approaches that they had seen in the past.
Yeah, I guess it was kind of easier for Sony to do with the history of the Walkman and the kind of cooler stuff like that. Was it hard to, convince people that it was actually going to be really cool? And having to get celebrities involved and stuff like that as well.
It was less about celebrities, but yeah, I mean, it absolutely, that was a concern from the beginning, and we did a lot of focus tests. And honestly, we had to get Microsoft to get out of its own way. I remember, when Bill went on stage and said, we're going to spend $100 million to market this thing. And it was kind of the cool thing that Microsoft was doing at the time. We were inundated by people from other parts of the company who wanted to be part of that. And a lot of them said, well, we're gamers, which, was kind of a mixed bag because a lot of times people who are gamers don't really understand the best way to make a game. And so we had to, be very cautious about it. But a lot of executives would come through and say, all right, we heard about this thing that you're wasting billions of the company's dollars on. Just tell us what it is so that we can get it over with. And, we'd explain it to them and they'd say, okay, but what's, okay, so it's going to play games and that sort of stuff, but what's the silver bullet? And I'd never heard that term before. What's the silver bullet? Well, it turns out this was a term that Microsoft used for marketing its products where, like, what's the feature? What's the one feature that puts you up against a competition that puts you over the top? Like, what's the silver bullet that kills the competition dead? And so they say, does it do photo editing or like, can it, run Office or web browsing? And we're like, no, it plays games. It plays games. They look better. They play better. They sound better than games on any other platform. And that's why people buy consoles is to be able to play those amazing games. Yeah. But, you got games, but they've got games. So like, what's the thing that's going to be your like your differentiator. And we're like, the games are going to be the differentiator. And we had to do focus groups to prove that. And in fact, we would go into focus groups and we'd say, okay, Microsoft, this is before we announced it, Microsoft is thinking about building a game console. Massive amounts of laughter in the room. Oh, the spreadsheet company? And then, of course, the invariable jokes would come out. It's going to blue screen. There's going to be patches, blah, blah, blah. Okay. The moderator would say, let's assume it's a really great console, though. Like, let's assume it's going to be really, really good. What do you imagine that this console would do? Somebody says, well, play games, obviously. Okay, obviously play games. What if it could play audio CDs? PlayStation could play audio CDs. What about that? Yeah, okay, fine. What about DVDs? DVDs are just becoming a thing right now. And people would say, yeah, that's pretty good. Free DVD player in my console because, we have a DVD player in the living room, but I'm going to put this in the bedroom. And so I could have a DVD player. But yeah, okay, that's good. Well, what else would have? What about like web browsing? It's like the record scratches. And people are like, whoa. We're not talking about a console now. We're talking about a PC. And then they're back to like, it's going to be bad. It's going to crash. And it's going to all that sort of stuff. Oh, no. Sorry. Did I say web browser? Oh, no, we're not going to do that. It's going to have like tips and tricks about, upcoming games and like videos and like all the stuff that you would see in a web browser, right? But like specifically around games, and then like people are like, oh, well, I like that idea. And so that became very, very important for us to understand that there is a line in people's minds where you move from being a console to a PC. Web browser was kind of where that line was. And so we would say things like, okay, so if Microsoft were to build a console, what do you think the benefits of Microsoft building that console would be? And they would say invariably three things. Number one, Bill Gates, the richest man in the world, will make sure that there is software for this thing. And they all had stories about the Atari Jaguar or 3DO or some sort of system that they had bought where they bought it and then the company moved away from it and there was no software for that. That's not going to happen with Bill. Number two, Microsoft has its fingers in all these technology pies. It's probably going to be very strong from a technology standpoint. They know secret things and, they have access to stuff. So it's going to be very advanced technologically. And that's why you saw a focus on the diversity of the software and on the power of the technology. And the third thing that they focused on was network gaming. At the time, nobody was doing network gaming. The Dreamcast had come out with a modem. We decided to forego the modem and put in an Ethernet jack. And a lot of people were very, very surprised by that because, there were no Ethernet connections behind the television. But what a lot of people said was, I think that over this generation of consoles, this next console I buy, I think that during the time that I own that network gaming is going to become important. And so even though I don't do it now, I want a console that has the ability to do that down the road. And so that's why the third thing that we really focused on was Xbox Live and all the networking capability. We heard that. And the other thing that we heard loud and clear on top of those three things was, Microsoft kind of stands behind this thing and Microsoft brings those benefits, but Microsoft is not a consumer company. And so that's why all the early messaging was basically Xbox from Microsoft. And it was not the Microsoft Xbox. The Microsoft part was there, but it was a secondary thing that stood behind the product. And, a lot of the early press around that was like, look, we're in our own building that's off campus. And, we, ride skateboards and we, do all these crazy things you don't think of Microsoft doing, because that was meant to say, look, yes, we are part of the Microsoft family and we take advantage of all the benefits from that, but we are doing something that is very different than what the company has done before and is really focused on, developing the best possible console that we can deliver, not sort of doing our own thing and getting people to come over to it.
So I guess one of our last questions would be, which is one I'm absolutely dying to ask. I read that you were there in the meeting when Microsoft discussed buying out Nintendo. What was that like and how did that go down?
It was horrible. So, before spending billions of the company's dollars, the executive team really wanted to make sure that they had left no stone unturned. It was very important to be in that business. It was unclear whether the right approach was to build, our own hardware and spend all the money and do all this sort of stuff because, Microsoft really, for all of the criticisms of Microsoft that have been leveled at it over the years, is a very collaborative company. I mean, it works very closely with hardware manufacturers and software developers. And And so going out on its own and building a piece of hardware was something it had never done before. It never built its own PC. It had never kind of done that stuff. It enabled other people to do that. And so one of the things that, that Steve Ballmer in particular really wanted to do is to make sure that no stone had been left unturned. So he said, before we do this, I want you to go down the road to Nintendo and ask whether they would, be interested in potentially, some sort of a merger opportunity. And we knew that, from years and years of working with Nintendo, that they were a fiercely independent company that, that had a perspective on the industry and on the world, and that it was unlikely that they were going to be receptive to that. But we set up the meeting. Now, at that time, Microsoft and Nintendo were literally neighbors. Like, we could see Nintendo's U.S. headquarters from the front door of our building where we were designing Xbox. And, their employees and our employees went to the same fitness club as an employee benefit. And so we would hang out with them. They would beta test Microsoft hardware and software and that sort of stuff. Obviously, when we announced that we were going into the console business, that changed dramatically. And, an edict went out from Nintendo that you can no longer do anything with Microsoft anymore. And in fact, a lot of the Xbox team were learning to ride motorcycles on a little parking lot that had been used by the fitness club while they were rebuilding their parking garage. Nintendo immediately brought out the bulldozers and tore up that parking lot. But we were dispatched to go meet with them. It was just people that were clearly speaking two different languages, both literally and figuratively. I think the Nintendo team was polite, but they just thought it was an absurd notion that they would ever give up their independence and be acquired by anybody, much less Microsoft. They were very excited about the prospects of GameCube and, very excited about their own internal game development capabilities and their franchises, and they just didn't see a point to it. And so, it was very difficult, having put all this time and effort into developing what we thought was a really great notion for Xbox, which was really more designed to focus on the PlayStation audience than the Nintendo audience, and then to put that aside and go hat in hand to Nintendo and say, hey, what do you think about joining forces? It did not go well. And obviously, as we can all tell, it never really went anywhere. But that was kind of frustrating to be kind of told, hey, put all of your dreams on hold for Xbox. Go see if maybe we can just get out of this by buying another company. Especially given my love and admiration and affection for Nintendo, to be put in that position was awkward.
A pretty interesting piece of game history. Now you're working with Dave & Buster's as well, and that seems to be going fantastically. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yes, I joined just shy of 10 years ago. I'm the Senior Vice President of Entertainment and Game Strategy. Our team is responsible for really everything to do with entertainment within our 150 locations across the U.S. and Canada. We just announced recently that we're going to be expanding into the Middle East. We also acquired a company called Main Event that is focused on a slightly younger demographic and incorporates bowling and laser tag and gravity courses and things like that. And for me, it kind of comes full circle because what I love about Dave & Buster's and about the arcade industry in general is that it is that physical connection of playing games together in a social environment. The games are very, very casual. In fact, it's not so much about the games themselves as it is about that social experience that you have with your friends. So for me, growing up, where my friends would come over to my house and we played John Madden football on a Sega Genesis, and the four of us would be sat on a couch together playing side by side. That experience still exists, even in a world where you have PlayStation Network or Xbox Live, and you can play against 200 people, but you're never with them physically. That sort of experience is part of the overall experience. The reason why Xbox exists in large part is because we were successful at convincing Microsoft that people play different kinds of games in different kinds of settings on different kinds of platforms, and that what you play on a console is different than what you play on a PC, which is different than what you play on a mobile device, which is different than what you play in an arcade. And so I think it's all part of a well-rounded experience for people who really love games the way that I love games and the way that I'm sure you guys love games. That, sometimes you want to play a game 2 feet away from a giant high resolution screen with a keyboard and a mouse. Sometimes you want to play sat back on a couch with a wireless control in your hand. Sometimes you want to play on a mobile device on a train or a bus, and sometimes you want to play with your friends. And for us, Dave & Buster's is just shy of 40 years old. And I think what's made it really special and unique is that it combines not only arcade games, but also food and beverage. So you go out with your mates for a night on the town and you have, some cocktails and you play some games, you win some prizes, you have a steak, and you go home happy. And you remember the time that you had with your friends, much like I remember growing up with my friends with bumper cars and arcade games back in Wichita, Kansas many years ago. And I'm really, really happy about that. And I'm glad that it's that the arcade industry has remained vibrant and much more successful than people think. Dave & Buster's has a nearly $2 billion a year turnover, which I think surprises people who want to convince themselves that arcades went the way of the pet rock back in the late 70s or early 80s. Our experience is very broad and very general, and it's really kind of game focused, and it's centered around that, and I couldn't be more proud of that.
Well, if anybody wants to check them out, we've got one in Manchester and we've got one in Birmingham as well. So our UK guys can go and check that out. Well, Kevin, it's been amazing having you on, and thank you so much for doing this interview.
It's my pleasure. I enjoy talking about this, and I thought that you guys asked some very, very insightful questions, including some topics that I probably rather left forgotten, but I'll go have a drink and try to forget again.